Welcome to the Chapter 2.6 overview, the environmental consequences of connectivity. So in the previous chapter, we looked at cultural consequences or effects, and now we're on the topic of environmental, which remembers the blue color in your highlighting. So now for our essential question, it's pretty straightforward. What were some of the environmental effects of trade in Afro-Eurasia? And so again, we looked at this in the last chapter, but this is a causation question that will only focus on effects. So if I was doing a full analysis, I might have two different environmental effects. So let's look at relevance. In 2019, there are some conflicts over the destruction of the Amazon to make way for new farmland. That's what we see here in this picture. And while countries like Brazil do need more food to feed a growing population, as we'll see in the chapter today, there are some lasting effects on farmland when you cut down trees. Another thing we've seen in the news in the last year or so are disease outbreaks. There was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, for instance, and one of the things we see is that as societies are interconnected by trade, a disease outbreak in one place can easily affect greater and greater numbers of people because they can spread through those connections. So now for context, I'm looking at these environmental effects. So some details I was thinking of including had to do with a reminder of the major trade networks. I only have Indian Ocean and Silk Roads because the Trans-Saharan, as we'll see, doesn't really come up too much in this chapter. So again, I'm looking for details that are relevant to the prompt. And so I know that there's a third network, the Trans-Saharan, but if it's not going to be something I want to focus on, then I won't bring it up. The other relevant fact is that there's different regions coming into contact with each other. So I have a statement that trade networks expanded and brought people from different regions together. I named my two trade networks here, and I said they link diverse societies. Since I'd already said this up here, I decided to be a little more specific and say from Asia to Europe. And so these are my details for my number one in my success criteria. And down here, this is the part where I'm trying to explain the connection, where I'm saying there were environmental consequences as traders sought to meet that demand. So I'm not answering the question yet, but I'm establishing the background. Okay, so from our unit guide, we're looking at the environmental effects over here. Here's our overall question. And there's some categories that are broken down for us. One is the diffusion of crops and pathogens. So we have crops. Pathogen is another word for disease, and that's along trade routes. So we'll be looking at examples of crops being spread. We'll also be looking at some negative environmental effects during this time period, and then we'll finish with disease. So we start with champa rice, which we looked at in section 1.1, so hopefully this is familiar to you. Champa rice is a variety of rice that is resistant to drought and ripens twice as fast. So you could have two crops in a year instead of one. It was introduced to China around the 11th century, so it's roughly starting right about here on this graph. And you can see in the next 100 years or so, there is a significant growth in population because you have more food and so you have more people. Another technology that was important for China is that they developed a technique of terracing. Rice grows underwater essentially, so if you cut these steps into the hillside, you can grow rice on them. So the rice and the terracing led to a population growth. It also led to a transfer of more people to southern China, which is where the food was grown. So the next crop is bananas. Bananas were introduced to Africa from Southeast Asia. So they started around what is now Indonesia, and you can see in this direction, they were introduced first to Madagascar, which is this island right here. So if I move up to this map, here's Madagascar. From Madagascar, they were introduced through that trade connection to Eastern Africa. And the green on this map is showing the production of bananas. So you can see that it spread from that location throughout much of Africa. A significant feature of the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa is that they developed from this group of people called the Bantu, as you can see on this map following these arrows, migrated and spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. There is a staple crop in this kind of Western Africa region here, which is the yam. But the yam doesn't grow very well down in these regions. So one of the things that's important in places like over here is that bananas replaced yams as the staple crop, allowing this migration to continue. So our next two crops are sugar and citrus. Sugar originated in Southeast Asia, and following the Indian Ocean trade routes and a little bit of Silk Roads trade, if you look up here, it spread to the Arabian Peninsula. And with our time period, what we're looking at is that Islamic traders spread it across North Africa. Remember, this is under Islamic control. And through Islamic influence in Europe, it gets introduced to Europe But sugar cannot grow in Europe. It's too cold in Europe to grow it. And one of the things we'll see is that demand in future centuries, so remember we're stopping at about 1450 here, but in the 1500s, after European colonization of the Americas, sugar production becomes a major centerpiece of colonization and the slave trade. So just kind of for the future, keep that in mind. For now, sugar was traded extensively on the Silk Road's trade network, for instance, in cities like Samarkand, and it was in high demand. It's really the same process for citrus foods, and they don't have quite the same demand and importance, in this direction that sugar does, but it's another example of a crop that was introduced to Europe and Asia through trade, in this case through Islamic traders, who brought citrus foods from South and Southeast Asia and introduced them into Eurasia. So now we're looking at some negative environmental effects in general, these three right here. You might remember that Zimbabwe was an example of overgrazing. So this picture is showing the effects of grazing on the landscape. And as the grasses disappear, obviously your cattle cannot eat anything, and so you lose your food source. And it also creates environmental damage, which is related to deforestation. So that picture we had of the Amazon earlier, what happens is you cut down trees, shown in this picture right here, is you get a lot of runoff when it rains. And the runoff washes all the soil down, and it washes away the topsoil, and the topsoil is where a lot of the nutrients are. So you kind of need these trees to preserve the soil. And so in areas that cut down a lot of trees to create land for farming, it actually created a problem of soil erosion. And when you have soil erosion, you have your food production going down because the soil cannot support the food anymore. And another cause of reduced food production was the Little Ice Age, which we also talked about in a previous section. But with cooling temperatures, you get less food production. And so these things cause population to decline in many areas. So now we're in our last section here down here about disease. The Mongol Empire helped to spread disease, ironically. We've talked about the Pax Mongolica and the fact that in the Mongol Empire there was this unity in this area right here that focused on a lot of trade. But with that unity and the movement of goods, we also get the movement of disease. So this map is showing the spread of the bubonic plague. That's what these red arrows are right here. And we think it originated in China. You can see that's kind of the vector here of the spread. And it's hard to see, but all these dates have little red dots by them, and they are all outbreaks of the plague. And these are all kind of in the 1350s. So there's a major outbreak here in China, and then there's a major outbreak over here in Europe. We also think that in addition to it probably being spread along the Indian Ocean routes this way, we also think that those caravanserai that we talked about were also instrumental in spreading plague because as people stopped, they would transmit it to each other. So remember, what happens with trade networks is you're bringing diverse groups of people into contact with each other. So before the unification of this trade network, you didn't really get people from China interacting directly with people from Europe. But the trade, this relay trade, as people move along the way, and things like the fleas can get there, now you have these two diverse societies interacting with each other. And Europe, which had not had exposure to diseases like the plague, suffered greatly. So you can see in this map here, so the plague is mostly around the 1350s or so. So if you look on this map, that would be like starting right about here or so, and you can see that there's a population decline happening. This one that represents China is an earlier outbreak of the plague, and then in this area kind of right about here, we see that the population is going down. In Europe, it's possible that there were as many as a third of the population may have died during the plague. And in China, we think it was about 25 million people in China and in Asia who died during the plague. When you have more people dying, you have a decline of agriculture, which means you have less food produced, which means you have even more people dying. And combined with the Little Ice Age and the environmental effects we saw in the previous slide about the deforestation and the soil erosion, it was a really devastating time for population patterns. The timeline's pretty short. Again, this is one of those chapters where we're really looking at big picture processes like the trade of sugar or something, which doesn't really have a date. So we just have the Black Death. It's important to have a sense of when this happened in the span of history. So now let's review the essential question. Again, we were looking at environmental effects, and we had a section starting off with agricultural effects specifically and the introduction of new crops. So here's our examples right here. And then more generally, environmental effects, we have soil damage. That's that process of the nutrients of the soil going away because of overgrazing and deforestation. And then we have the spread of disease. And so these effects are all negative, and they tended to cause populations to decline. And these effects up here tended to cause populations to increase. That's your chapter 2.6 overview. Happy studying.
Honey, oh, sugar, sugar.